And we are live. Hello, this is Luke Stearns, and this is my Trace the Pathway presentation for our Juvenile Justice Concepts class, taught by Professor Robert Schaffner. Now, in this presentation, we are going to be discussing the criminal justice pathways that separate between juvenile and adult processes. Now, to start, I want to apologize. Normally, when I do these screencast presentations, I do this with a PowerPoint. But due to a myriad of technical difficulties that I've been having with my computer lately, and being somewhat pressed for time, I've had to improvise a little bit. So what I have done is I have prepared a couple of point paragraphs that are going to briefly point out specific points in the presentation, and then I will discuss them in detail as we go through. So let's go ahead and get started. So to start, the focus of this presentation is going to be on more specifically murder, specifically first-degree murder, but I've added both first-degree murder and manslaughter to both explain the differences of the two of them, but also explain the different processes for both adults and juveniles. Because they are different from each other, and as such, there's a different process the way each one is put together, both for adults and for juveniles, and how they're processed. As with anything, I like to start best with understanding the definitions that we're working with. So the definition of first-degree murder, as it is implied in most states, is it is defined as an unlawful killing that is both willful and premeditated, meaning that it was committed after planning or, in quotations, lying in wait for the victim. This is the basic concept of what we think of, what first comes to mind when the word murder comes to mind. This was something that was planned, and it was premeditated, it was thought out, and there's really not a whole lot of defense behind it. You know, this isn't a situation where insanity is generally pleaded. You know, this was a malicious, heinous act that was thought through. The person who committed it knew what they were doing, and, you know, the consequences are as it is expected. Now, manslaughter is different. Manslaughter is defined as the unjustifiable, inexcusable, and intentional killing of a human being without deliberation, premeditation, or malice. So, the unlawful killing of a human being without any deliberation, which may be involuntary, and the commission of a lawful act without due caution and circumspection. Now, where manslaughter differs from murder, or specifically first-degree murder, is that manslaughter very often can be considered, it's not premeditated, it's not thought out. Very often, I wouldn't say that it happens by chance per se, but it's one of those perfect storm situations where it just kind of happens. It doesn't make it unjustifiable, it doesn't make it excusable, and it's not without its punishment, because usually in order for the right factors to be put in place for, you know, the perfect storm, so to speak, of manslaughter to occur, there has to be a decent amount of negligence that could have been avoided. Now, as I said previously, it does differ from murder, specifically first-degree murder, in that there's a difference between the premeditation versus this just happened. And again, it doesn't make it justifiable, but in that specific definition, it does make it ultimately different from the two. Now we're going to discuss some of the differences specifically between the adult and juvenile offender processes. Specifically, we're going to start with the difference between manslaughter and murder. Now, again, as the focus of this class is in juvenile justice concepts, that's going to be the primary focus. We will discuss the adult process, but the primary focus is going to be the juvenile process. And I think that's where, in this case, the whole manslaughter-murder situation, or scenario, so to speak, works best as an informative presentation for juvenile justice, because for adults, whether it's manslaughter or whether it's murder, it's usually pretty cut and dry. depending on which case it is between manslaughter or murder, the process is the same. The offender is picked up. The offender will go through trial. Whether there's a confession, there's a consistent through trial, as in the defendant has pleaded not guilty. So there's a trial, the evidence is gathered, and in the case of being found guilty of either manslaughter or first-degree murder, the sentencing will carry through. And the sentencing, obviously, it differs between the states, but for the most part, the sentencing for adults is very cut and dry, and the process just carries through. It's basically, I mean, and I hate to say this because this sounds, for lack of a better term, it's a little hokey, but kind of takes away from the collegiate informative process of the presentation. But basically, an adult convicted of murder, the process, if anybody's ever watched Law and Order or any type of crime drama, that's basically the process that carries through. It's very cut and dry. For juvenile offenders, the process is not quite as cut and dry as it is for adults, for a couple of reasons. Number one, because with juveniles, the criminal justice system puts somewhat of a heavier focus on rehabilitation than I would probably say with adults. But also, the criminal justice, the actual process of moving the juvenile offender through the system is a little bit different, in also the construct between manslaughter and murder, but how it gets situated, it's very much on a case-by-case basis. Now, as it is a case-by-case basis, we'll look at, starting out, how it's going to differ between manslaughter and murder, because even though with either case it's going to be substantially different from an adult offender, there's also differences between whether it's manslaughter or whether it's murder. With manslaughter, there's a lot of different factors to consider, and there's a lot of different factors that will be considered and taken into the court process regarding a conviction of manslaughter, because manslaughter has a lot of different factors. Again, we talked about that perfect storm that creates the manslaughter situation. Now, with murder, it'll still be a case-by-case basis because there is a heavier focus on rehabilitation towards juvenile offenders. But what can also be said is that for a juvenile offender who has been convicted or is otherwise on trial for murder, specifically first-degree murder, there is a very high probability that the juvenile offender will be tried as an adult, as opposed to being tried in juvenile court. Now, let's talk a little bit about specific concepts within juvenile murder convictions. Now, the two concepts that we're going to look at for juvenile murder convictions are what is called the waiver and what is called the automatic transfer. Now, both of these concepts involve a juvenile offender being essentially tried as an adult, as would very often be the case for a juvenile offender who's been found guilty of murder 1. Now, the first one that we're going to discuss is what's called the waiver or the waiver petition. Now, in the majority of states, a juvenile offender has to be at least the age of 16 to be eligible to be waived to adult court. And basically, when this happens for a few reasons. And it's court ordered, and it's very much on a case-by-case basis. But some, not stipulations, but some reasons why a juvenile would be waived by the court into adult court to be tried is that the juvenile has been charged with a particular serious offense. The juvenile has a lengthy, continuous juvenile record. The minor is older. Again, most states require that the juvenile be at least 16 years old. Past rehabilitation efforts for the juvenile have been unsuccessful. Again, we talked about that before, that there is a heavier focus on rehabilitation towards juvenile offenders, but sometimes that just doesn't always work. And otherwise, youth services would have to work with the juvenile offender for a long time. So the biggest thing why there would be a waiver is that the offense that the juvenile has been put in is a strong one, and there's been a continuous juvenile criminal record for the offender. So in this situation, when it's waived, it is, even though it's on a case-by-case basis, the offender in this situation would have a very long record and a continuous record of delinquency. And by that point, any rehabilitation, any type of juvenile rehabilitation would have been considered unsuccessful, and they're moving up to the big leagues, so to speak. Now, the second and last concept is what's called the automatic transfer. Now, the automatic transfer is a little bit like the waiver petition, except it's more like the express lane version of the waiver petition. Now, the automatic transfer is used if the offender is a certain age or older. Again, in most states, it's usually going to be 16, and the charges involve a serious or violent offense such as rape or murder. And this is where we come to the reason why I specifically chose murder in this. In the case of the automatic transfer, and in the case of murder, there is almost, I would say, a 98% chance that the juvenile offender will be tried as an adult, because that is considered to be a violent crime. Of course, it's considered to be a heinous crime, and especially if a juvenile offender is on trial for first-degree murder, there's premeditation that comes along with that, and there's not a whole lot of defense otherwise, especially if, say, the offender has a long record, already a long juvenile record. So in the case of murder, specifically murder in the first degree, an automatic transfer would be the most likely. The waiver petition could likely happen, but in this case, it's more likely that the offender is going to go straight to the front of the line. And in the event that that happens, when a juvenile offender is tried as an adult, we go back to the cut and dry formula of adult court. The court date will be set up, the trial will begin. If there's a plea of not guilty, then the trial will continue forward, just as the same with adult court. And the other thing, the most important thing as it applies to the juvenile justice concepts here, is that once a juvenile offender is in adult court, they are basically treated entirely like an adult. And that includes the resulting conviction and sentencing. When a juvenile offender is brought into adult court, however they are convicted, they will be convicted as an adult, and they will serve a sentence that an adult would. If a juvenile offender is found guilty of first-degree murder, they will not, generally speaking, and again, it's a case-by-case basis, but generally speaking, they will not be given any sanctions because they are a juvenile or because they're under the age of 18. For a crime heinous enough to either have the waiver petition or the automatic transfer up to adult court, there will be no slack given for that. They will basically serve the exact same, in the case of murder in the first degree, prison sentence that an adult would. And that's where I find that the presentation concept of murder is an excellent information piece in discussing the differences and very much the similarities between adult offenders and juvenile offenders. I certainly hope that this presentation has been helpful. Again, I apologize for the choppiness. It would have been much easier to do this on a PowerPoint, but improvisation always prevails. So I'm going to hover over our references for the last couple of seconds of the presentation. Again, thank you very much for being the audience, and I hope this was informative, and have a nice day.